A single photograph captured 1,000 women outside Murray's Mills in 1907. By 1985, every single Manchester cotton mill had vanished. The industry that once clothed a quarter of humanity, gone in one lifetime. Manchester processed more raw cotton annually than all of India. The Bridgewater Canal ran black with dye. Snow fell gray from cotton lint in the air. Children identified neighbors' workplaces by the rattle of looms at 5 a.m. This wasn't just industry, it was civilization. 2,840 spinning mules, 108 weaving sheds, 220,000 workers. Then the collapse. 94% of jobs disappeared between 1951 to 1981. Mill closures hit 17 per year. Victorian structures stood empty, too expensive to demolish, too obsolete to use. That 1907 photograph now hangs in a museum. Outside, the building has been converted into luxury flats, selling for £220,000. The new residents have never touched cotton. They live inside the corpse of an empire, unaware they're walking through a graveyard. This is how Britain's textile empire died, and nobody remembers. The story begins not in Manchester, but 20 miles south, in a wooded valley beside the River Ballan. Samuel Gregg, a merchant's son from Belfast, purchased land at Style in 1784. He was 20 years old. His uncle had left him £1,000, a substantial sum but hardly a fortune. Gregg's innovation was not technological. His water frames were purchased from Richard Arkwright, but organizational. He recognized that a rural mill offered advantages: reliable water power, cheap land, and most crucially, access to pauper apprentices from Liverpool and Manchester workhouses. Quarrybank Mill, as Gregg named it, began operations in 1784 with 24 workers. Within a decade, that number had grown to 252, more than half of them children aged 7 to 13. The apprentices lived in dormitories adjacent to the mill, worked 13-hour days, and received rudimentary education on Sundays. This was not cruelty by the standards of the age, it was reform. Gregg provided medical care, regular meals, and accommodations superior to the urban slums from which the children had been extracted. His mills became a model. By 1820, the Gregg family employed over 2,000 workers across 4 sites, producing 5 million yards of calico annually. The apprentice system, however, contained the seeds of its own destruction. As steam power replaced water wheels, mills migrated to urban centers where coal was cheap and adult labor plentiful. Gregg's sons expanded operations into Manchester, purchasing land in Bury and establishing the massive Lancaster Mill in 1845. But the family's paternalistic model, housing, schools, profit sharing, became economically unviable as competition intensified. The Greggs sold their interests in 1847. Samuel Gregg died that same year, aged 83, having witnessed the transformation of cotton manufacture from artisanal craft to industrial behemoth. On April 19, 1861, President Abraham Lincoln ordered a naval blockade of Confederate ports. Within 6 months, the flow of raw cotton to Liverpool dwindled to 3% of pre-war levels. Manchester's mills ground to a halt. By December 1862, 485,434 cotton workers in Lancashire were either unemployed or on short time. This was not a recession, it was an economic apocalypse. The famine revealed the industry's fatal dependency. Lancashire had built its empire on a single raw material, sourced from a single region, transported through a single port. When that supply chain broke, the entire structure collapsed. Workers rioted in Stalybridge. Families pawned furniture to buy bread. The poor rate in Ashton-under-Lyne increased by 400%. Yet simultaneously, an extraordinary thing occurred. The unemployed cotton workers of Lancashire, many facing starvation, held mass meetings to declare their support for the Union cause and the abolition of slavery. On New Year's Eve, 1862, a delegation of Manchester workers sent an address to Abraham Lincoln, stating their conviction that emancipation was worth their suffering. Lincoln replied personally, acknowledging their sublime Christian heroism. The exchange became legendary, a moment of moral clarity in the midst of catastrophe. But the economic lesson was ignored. When the war ended and cotton flowed again, the industry rebuilt precisely as before, vertically integrated, geographically concentrated, dependent on American supply. The opportunity to diversify, to source from India or Egypt to develop synthetic alternatives was squandered. The famine should have been a warning. Instead, it became merely an interlude. The year 1913 represents the statistical summit of British cotton manufacture. Lancashire produced 8 billion square yards of cloth. The industry employed 621,000 workers. Britain controlled 65% of global cotton textile exports. Manchester's Royal Exchange, completed in 1874, was the largest commercial room in the world, covering 8,000 square meters, accommodating 7,000 cotton merchants, trading simultaneously beneath a vaulted glass ceiling. The floor murmured with negotiations conducted in 18 languages. Fortunes were made and lost before lunch. A single merchant, Rylands and Sons, owned 41 mills and employed 15,000 workers. The scale defied comprehension. A single mill, the India Mill in Darwin, consumed 30 tons of raw cotton daily. The Beehive Mill in Bolton contained 91,152 spindles on 6 floors, operating 24 hours a day in 3 shifts. The Spencer Street Works in Oldham housed 2,400 looms, producing gray cloth that would be finished, dyed, and shipped to Calcutta, Lagos, Shanghai. Britain imported 2.1 million bales of raw cotton annually, each bale weighing 400 pounds, transported by a fleet of dedicated cargo vessels from Galveston, New Orleans, Bombay, Alexandria. The wealth generated was obscene. Cotton magnates built Gothic mansions in the Cheshire countryside. They endowed libraries, established technical colleges, purchased art collections. But the prosperity was brittle. It depended on the continuation of free trade, the absence of protectionism, and the industrial backwardness of colonized markets. These conditions would not last. Already in 1913, Indian mills were producing 1.2 billion yards annually for domestic consumption. Japanese production had reached 800 million yards. The Italians, Germans, and Americans were modernizing aggressively. Lancashire's complacency was monumental. The First World War should have modernized British cotton. Instead, it accelerated decline. Profits surged as demand for military textiles exploded, but the windfall was consumed by dividends rather than reinvestment. Between 1914 and 1920, the industry paid out £147 million in profits, while spending only £31 million on new equipment. Mills continued operating Victorian-era mule spindles and non-automatic looms, while American factories installed ring frames and Northrop looms that required 75% fewer workers to produce equivalent output. The technological backwardness was compounded by structural fragmentation. Lancashire's cotton industry consisted of approximately 2,500 separate firms, most of them single mill operations. Spinning was organizationally separate from weaving. Finishing and dyeing were outsourced to specialist converters. This vertical disintegration had once been efficient, allowing rapid scaling and specialization. By the 1920s, it had become a death sentence. Integrated American and Japanese mills could coordinate production, minimize waste, and undercut British prices by 20%, even after accounting for shipping costs. Attempts at rationalization failed spectacularly. The Lancashire Cotton Corporation, established in 1929 to consolidate mills and eliminate excess capacity, acquired 96 firms controlling 10 million spindles. The scheme was a disaster. The corporation overpaid for obsolete assets, failed to implement coherent management structures, and hemorrhaged money. By 1931, it was effectively bankrupt, bailed out by the Bank of England. The fundamental problem was not financial but cultural. Mill owners, often second or third generation inheritors, lacked the ruthlessness to close uneconomic operations. Workers' unions, desperate to preserve jobs, resisted automation. The entire industry drifted, trapped between past glories and future irrelevance. Mule spinning was an art. The operative, known as a mule spinner, managed a machine containing up to 1,320 spindles, stretched across a 60-foot frame. The mule moved backward and forward, drafting and twisting cotton fibers into yarn while the spinner adjusted tension, monitored for breaks, and pieced broken threads. Experienced spinners could detect yarn defects by sound alone, identifying tension inconsistencies from 15 feet away. Training required 7 years of apprenticeship. Spinners earned between £4 and £6 per week in 1920, elite wages for industrial labor. They were craftsmen, proud and irreplaceable. Ring frames invented in America required no such skill. A single operative, usually a woman paid half the spinner's wage, could monitor 4 ring frames simultaneously. The yarn quality was marginally inferior, but consistent and cheap. Lancashire resisted rings for decades. Union agreements protected mule spinners' jobs. Mill owners, many of them former spinners themselves, were sentimentally attached to the technology of their youth, but sentiment could not withstand economics. By 1960, ring frames had captured 80% of British spinning capacity. The mule spinners, the aristocrats of cotton labor, vanished into redundancy. Weaving witnessed a parallel extinction. Handloom weavers, numbering 240,000 in 1820, had been displaced by power looms by mid-century. But power loom weaving still demanded skill, 4 looms per weaver, constant attention, manual cloth inspection. The Northrop automatic loom, introduced in America in 1894, allowed a single weaver to manage 30 looms. Lancashire adopted Northrop slowly, hindered by Union resistance and capital constraints. By the time British mills mechanized in the 1960s, the technology was obsolete. Japanese mills were implementing computer-controlled looms, requiring 1 operator per 100 machines. The skills cultivated over 6 generations evaporated within a decade. Men and women who had entered the mills at 13, who knew cotton by touch and smell, who could diagnose machinery problems by the quality of vibration through brick floors, found themselves technologically obsolete at 40. The bankruptcy court sat in Manchester every Thursday. During the 1960s, petitions arrived weekly. Platt Brothers, manufacturer of textile machinery, and once the world's largest engineering firm, closed in 1963. Court Alds, the synthetic fiber giant that had attempted to consolidate the industry, abandoned cotton spinning in 1968. Government intervention was half-hearted and incoherent. The Cotton Industry Act of 1959 provided £30 million for scrapping excess capacity, a bribe to shut down mills quietly. Over 100,000 jobs disappeared between 1958 and 1963. The political will to save the industry did not exist. Labor governments, dependent on union support, offered subsidies and tariff protection. Conservative governments preached free market discipline and blamed workers for pricing themselves out of competitiveness. Neither approach addressed the fundamental problem. British cotton manufacture was uneconomical at any wage level against Asian competition. Indian mills paid workers 8 shillings per week. Pakistani mills paid less. Textile tariffs were globally declining under GATT agreements. The industry was swimming against a tide too strong to resist. Individual mill closures became communal traumas. When Cardwell Mill in Stockport announced closure in 1964, 800 workers lost jobs. Many had worked there for 30 years. The mill had sponsored football teams, provided Christmas parties for workers' children, served as the center of community life. Its demolition left a wound in the neighborhood's fabric that never healed. Similar scenes played out across Lancashire, Oldham, Bolton, Rochdale, Blackburn. Entire towns built around cotton hollowed out. Unemployment surged. High streets died. The sons and daughters of cotton workers migrated to London, Birmingham, or abroad. What remained were pensioners and memories. Quarry Bank Mill, where Samuel Gregg began his fortune, is now a National Trust property. Visitors pay £15 to tour reconstructed workshops, watch costumed interpreters demonstrate carding and spinning, and purchase tea towels in the gift shop. The apprentice house has been restored, furnished with period-appropriate beds and cookware. School groups arrive by coach to learn about industrial history. It is tasteful, educational, and profoundly sanitized. The smell is absent. No lanolin, no machine oil, no human sweat. The noise is absent. The modern demonstrations use electric motors, not steam engines rattling at 200 revolutions per minute. The danger is absent. The machinery is inert, hedged with barriers and warning signs. Murray's Mills in Ancoats, where that photograph was taken in 1907, has been converted into 285 residential units, marketed as urban industrial living. One-bedroom flats sell for £220,000. The developers retained the brick facade and installed floor-to-ceiling windows. The interior bears no trace of its previous function. The building is beautiful, gentrified, hollow. A small plaque near the entrance mentions the site's history in 3 sentences. None of the current residents work in textiles. Most work in finance, technology, or the service economy. They appreciate the exposed brickwork aesthetically, unaware that it was built to withstand the vibration of 500 power looms operating simultaneously. Elsewhere, the erasure is complete. The India Mill chimney in Darwin, once the tallest in Britain at 303 feet, was demolished in 1967. The Trencherfield Mill engine house in Wigan survives, preserved because it contains a 2,500 horsepower steam engine, considered historically significant. The engine runs on demonstration days, a spectacle for enthusiasts. But the 800 workers who once relied on that engine for their livelihoods are absent from the narrative. The heritage industry has no interest in economic failure, in structural unemployment, in the human cost of deindustrialization. It prefers romance, spinning jennies and factory reformers, progress and innovation. The dirt and desperation are edited out. In 2024, Bangladesh produces more cotton textiles annually than Britain produced in 1913. The Dhaka metropolitan area contains over 4,500 garment factories, employing 4 million workers. A seamstress in Gazipur earns approximately $95 per month, stitching clothes for Primark, H&M, and Zara. The factory where she works is a concrete structure, 6 stories, equipped with Chinese-manufactured sewing machines. It operates 24 hours daily. Fire exits are often locked. Ventilation is inadequate. In April 2013, the Rana Plaza factory complex in Dhaka collapsed, killing 1,134 workers. The building had been constructed illegally with substandard materials on swampy land. Inspectors had identified cracks the day before the collapse. Workers were ordered to return anyway. This is the endgame of the economic forces that destroyed Lancashire. Capital migrated to wherever labor was cheapest and regulations weakest. Manchester's cotton workers, with their unions and safety standards and £4 weekly wages, were outcompeted by workers earning a tenth as much under conditions that would have scandalized Victorian reformers. The moral calculus is uncomfortable. Those Bangladeshi factories lifted millions out of rural poverty. They provide income to women who would otherwise have no access to formal employment. Yet they perpetuate the extractive logic of the colonial cotton trade, now repackaged as free market globalization. A t-shirt purchased in Manchester today for £3.99 likely contains cotton grown in Texas, ginned in Louisiana, spun into yarn in India, woven into fabric in Pakistan, cut and sewn in Bangladesh, and shipped via Chinese logistics companies. The price reflects the ruthless efficiency of global supply chains and the collapse of labor power worldwide. The Lancashire cotton workers who once supplied the world have become consumers, purchasing the product of their own industry's destruction, manufactured by workers whose conditions they would have recognized from their grandparents' stories. The wheel has turned, but it has not progressed. No comprehensive museum documents the Lancashire cotton industry's rise and fall. The People's History Museum in Manchester contains exhibits on labor movements and trade unions, but its cotton collection is fragmentary. The Museum of Science and Industry displays spinning mules and weaving looms, explaining their mechanical principles without contextualizing their economic obsolescence. Local historical societies in Oldham, Bolton, and Blackburn maintain small archives staffed by volunteers, visited by genealogists and retirees. The national narrative has moved on. Britain's identity is no longer industrial. The mills are forgotten except as architectural curiosities in property development brochures. The demographic legacy is undeniable. Towns built on cotton never recovered. Burnley's population peaked at 97,000 in 1911. By 2021, it had fallen to 87,000. Rochdale, Accrington, Darwin all followed similar trajectories. Unemployment persisted for decades after the mills closed. The children of cotton workers, displaced into service jobs or long-term unemployment, inherited diminished expectations, health outcomes deteriorated, life expectancy gaps between Lancashire mill towns and affluent southern England widened to over 3 years. The mill closures were not merely economic events, but social catastrophes whose effects compounded across generations. The final irony: cotton production itself has not declined. Global production in 2024 exceeds 25 million tons, 5 times the 1913 level. Humanity consumes more cotton textiles than ever. What ended was not the industry, but its location. Lancashire's mills failed, not because cotton became obsolete, but because they occupied the wrong territory at the wrong moment in capitalism's evolution. The factors that once made Manchester ideal, proximity to coal, access to Atlantic shipping lanes, abundant cheap labor, became irrelevant when containerized shipping and air cargo made distance meaningless, and Chinese and Indian mill workers accepted wages that British workers would starve on. Samuel Gregg's descendants are alive. Some still live in Cheshire. The family fortune derived from cotton was invested into land, equities, and commercial property. It survived the industry's collapse. But the workers photographed outside Murray's Mills in 1907 left no such cushion for their descendants. Their skills were not fungible. Their pensions were minimal. Their towns were abandoned by capital and forgotten by government. The cotton mills made Britain wealthy, but the wealth did not stay with those who created it. It never does. That is the lesson Manchester teaches, written in demolished brickwork and empty factory floors. Not that industries die, all industries die, but that when they do, the people who depended on them are discarded with the obsolete machinery. No plaque marks this, no heritage tour explains it. The silence is the point.